So session 3 is called Beyond the Shifts. So what we're focusing on is those more kind of complicated interpersonal things that are more than just the tasks you're doing, that are very much about the dynamic that comes into play as a support worker and how complicated that can be sometimes. So, if you are new to us, my name's Ainsley. I am the CEO of Flying Kites, and I've worked in disability sports for 20 years, starting off as a support worker myself. And I'll probably have a few tales for you today about my own personal experiences with some of these fun complexities. So, if we leap on in, what we're going to do, we're going to go back to the captain and that analogy. We're going to talk about a couple of philosophical things around what are professional boundaries and the concept of duty of care and dignity of risk. Then I've got some scenarios and some common sticky places that people get stuck, as well as some tools and tricks. And we're going to talk a little bit about pay equity at the end, so that people have that information too. So, launching on in, we go back to our picture about the captain and their support crew. So, in the concept of professional boundaries, of conflicts of interest and confidentiality, we're thinking about the captain being this person who's deciding where the work is going. We're thinking about the captain being in charge um, of their life, of their goals, of the way that they're getting from here to there. But clearly, they can't do this alone. On this ship, they've got this crew because they need other people to help them on this journey. And so that becomes this need to be able to communicate with the support workers, this need to be able to clearly talk about what they need, to ask for tasks, and to keep things positive and collaborative on this ship. So it never happens alone. It's always a team effort. There's always whānau members, there's always members of the community, and there's support workers all trying to take this captain on their journey. So when we think about professional boundaries, it's primarily we're discussing you and the captain. But at the same time, there's actually dynamics that exist between each of these people, right? It never happens in isolation. And so we do need to consider all of that in light of the whole crew that supports the disabled person. So initially, we're going to have a conversation about professional boundaries. So, professional boundaries is a term used across so many different fields of work. Lots of human services kinds of work have professional boundaries. And if you sign up to, if you're like a social worker or a nurse or one of those things that has a professional peak body, there's often like a code of conduct that you sign up to saying if I'm going to call myself a nurse or a support worker or a whoever, um, not support worker, we don't have one. But then this is how I promise to behave. So professional boundaries are the things that change your dynamic between just you and a person you meet off the street and you and an employer. So in those instances, it's about kind of trying to manage that power imbalance because there's always a power imbalance, right? If they're paying you, they're your boss, you rely on them for your income each week, they hold a power. And in the same way, if you are the person who helps them to shower, if you're the person who helps them when they're vulnerable, then there's also a power imbalance where you have, kind of influence and control over what they're able to do. So part of professional boundaries is trying to keep things on as even a keel as we can. It's about trying to stay objective. So sometimes we get really embedded in the life of the person we're supporting, and it's trying to be able to take a step back and look at it through that professional lens of not just like, as my friend, what do I think, but actually as the support worker who's paid to come and help in this way. Um, what does my objective kind ofness need? And this going back to they are the captain, even if we have an opinion about what they should do with their life, it's not always up to us to have this say. And then it's about protecting well-being, right? It's about you not feeling like you're being imposed upon, asking for things that you're not able or willing to share. And in the same way, they're not having to give you things that they're not able or willing to share. So there's a few kind of key ways that it comes into play. It often comes into play when it comes to physical space. So about how you and this other person touch, how you and this other person are, kind of physically connected. And that's about, if you're helping someone in the shower, asking for a bit of consent before you touch them. It's if they're a person who really likes to hug and you don't really want hugs, being able to actually articulate that to the person you're supporting and saying, this is not this is not where I feel comfortable. This is how I'd like us to be. So it's sometimes about those sorts of things. Sometimes it's about emotional connection and remembering that actually you are paid to do a job. And so there's got to be some difference between that and freely given support. Although often in individualized funding spaces, people hold two roles. They are the paid support worker and they are also a family member, a neighbor, a friend. And so when there's the two dynamics at play, we also need to be even more aware of our professional boundaries and where we choose to put them, because in the end, professional boundaries are your own personal comfort level. They're what is right, what is ethical, and then it's what you personally like and what they personally like. So it's about how you interact, how you talk to each other, how they give you instructions, how you provide feedback, about maintaining some degree of professionalism in those conversations. And then often professional boundaries are around the tasks that they're getting you to do, the details of your shifts, the time you come to work, and being able to kind of put some things in place so that they are in a way that works for you, so that there is kind of some flexibility or some structure or system so that you feel like they are respecting your non-working life and those sorts of things. So that's the concept of professional boundaries. And generally, the best advice on all of these topics is to have that conversation up front. The earlier in a working relationship you can sit down and have a conversation about boundaries, the less likely it is that things will go wrong. So the ideal is that in that kind of getting the job interview process, you ask for some of those details if they're really important to you. Some of the stuff, we talked about previously around kind of checking if it's the right fit, and we talked about communication styles being compatible. Sometimes it is also around like physical boundaries and those sorts of things. If you are not going to be comfortable helping that person in the bathroom and that person needs you to help them in the bathroom, that's a really good thing to get clear at the beginning. If they are like a physical, touchy, holding hands when you're walking down the street because that's what makes them comfortable. If you are not that person, it's really good to get that sorted up front in the interview process rather than once you've got a job and then you go, oh, actually, every time we do this, I feel uncomfortable. It's not about you changing your boundaries to accommodate the needs of the person you are supporting. So if it's the wrong job, it's the wrong job. But there are definitely some people who, kind of match better with others. So having that conversation up front, what's important to you in the interview might be helpful. And then also in that first week or two of jobs, asking them, okay, so when you are going to give me a list of tasks, how am I going to know what's most important? Or, when shifts need to change, how are we going to talk about that? So that you are negotiating it up front if it's important to you, so that they don't just do it their way by default and end up causing a rift between you. But also know that boundaries can shift, that sometimes things are comfortable and other times things aren't. Sometimes you might be able to be flexible with your times and other times you can't. So knowing that just because you've communicated it at the beginning, you did that wonderful hard conversation up front, you might need to go back and refresh those things time and again, because things do shift and people also forget and go back to whatever their default is. So that is important. And then remembering who is the captain. So when you're deciding how you're going to manage a tricky situation, being clear which parts are about your preferences and vulnerabilities and which parts are about theirs, so that there is some, I guess, forgiveness of the way that they need to do things, and willingness to support them on their journey, but also not in a way that compromises your well-being or your needs. So yeah, knowing your own preferences, knowing your own boundaries, and going into that kind of eyes wide open is really important. So having said all of that, a key piece of this is around privacy and confidentiality. So privacy is the concept that everyone has the right to decide who has access to their personal information. That this should be not assumed that your information is freely given to whoever wants it, but instead that there is privacy, that people can choose who gets access to their information. Confidentiality is that once that information is given, that it will be treated with respect, that it will be treated like held only to the people that we've agreed for it to be shared with. So it's how that information is managed. So, for example, in that world, just because I choose to disclose to someone who's supporting me, if I choose to disclose a diagnosis to them, that doesn't mean I'm choosing to tell the whole world. That doesn't mean I'm choosing to tell their mum and their sister and their uncle. That doesn't mean I'm agreeing to tell the person at the shop or my neighbor. I'm just telling the person who is supporting me. So confidentiality says my support worker can't go tell all of these other people about my personal diagnosis unless they've talked to me about it. Um, but sometimes there is a need for that stuff to be shared, and sometimes it's really helpful for that stuff to be shared. So again, it comes down to a conversation about preferences. It comes down to a conversation about knowing where you both stand, and knowing that not all information is freely given, like is meant for everybody. And it goes both ways. It's also them respecting your confidentiality. So that also doesn't give them the right to tell them, you gave them a copy of your driver's license when you signed up, and then oh, now I know how old you are. I'm going to go tell everybody. That's not their right to do that either. So it goes in both directions. But I guess when we're in those support roles, it becomes standard practice, right? You're there, you're supporting a person because they have cerebral palsy. So you assume, well, no, you not assume. It's really easy to just make that a given of conversation. That's what your job is about. So that's what you do. But also knowing that that is actually confidential medical information. So thinking really carefully about how you talk about the person you're supporting and why you're sharing that information can be really helpful. And sometimes it's even little bits like sometimes when you go to certain shops and things, you can get a discount if you've got a disability, or the support worker can get in for free if the person has a disability. And so I've seen instances where somebody's, they've gone to the movies, they've tried to get a discount. And so the support workers just said, oh, they've got autism, so can I get in for free? Um, I would check that with the disabled person before you go announcing to the clerk at the movies that this person is autistic. That's not your information to give. Hey, look, go for the discounts, don't get me wrong, but not without the disabled person's consent. Sometimes people just make the assumption they see somebody in a wheelchair, they go, oh, they must have a disability, I'll give you the discount. And some disabilities are much more hidden. So in those instances, you do need to disclose if you want the discount. But that's not your call to make. That is the disabled person's call to make because it's their information. And so have that chat before you go announcing to the world that this is why you want a discount or this is why you want this information or why you're speaking on someone's behalf. Nothing wrong with doing it, just not cool to do it if you haven't talked to them about it first. So, dun dun dun. Another key element of this whole professional boundary stuff is a way up between the concept of duty of care and dignity of risk. So, duty of care is your obligation as an employee, but also as a human, to ensure the safety and well-being of others. So you have an obligation, an ethical need to try and keep people safe. And duty of care says we need to take reasonable steps to prevent harm. So if the person that you're supporting says, hey, guess what? I'm going to go jump off this building, it's 12 stories up. You have an obligation to try and stop them. You have an obligation to go, oh, I don't think that's a great idea. Because actually you can see, you can weigh up that risk and you, that is a very unsafe thing to do. Dignity of risk says that people have the right to make choices. People have the right to self-determine their life, to have goals and to live a life that may not completely agree with how you would like them to live their life. The concept of duty of dignity of risk is that they have the ability to take those risks, to make those choices in their life, and you shouldn't stop them from taking reasonable everyday risks. So I'm going to go jump off a 12-story building, not a reasonable risk. That is a geez, I should probably do something about it. I'm going to go bungee jumping unless there's some complicated like health factor in there. Um, that is a reasonable everyday risk. There is laws and all sorts of systems that prevent people from prevent that from being an unmanageable risk. So as a support worker, you look at it, you go, actually, how reasonable is this risk? And then if they're going to go bungee jumping, it's ensuring that they understand the choice and then letting them do that. But if they're going to jump off a 12-story building, trying to stop that one from happening. So duty of care and dignity of risk is trying to create this way up that says they don't have to live the life that you want them to live. They don't even have to make sensible and um, like really healthy decisions every day. But you are supposed to step in if they're doing something really risky. So this is the difference between I know that I'm supposed to be losing weight, but I'm going to go buy myself McDonald's. Your job is not to stand in front of them and like block the door and don't let them get McDonald's. Um, but it probably is to remind them that they were doing this healthy eating thing. It's a really different level of risk from I'm kind of light a bonfire in the middle of my bedroom. Okay, I don't know that you've understood the risks of lighting a bonfire in the middle of your bedroom. Let's try and do something about that. So what often happens because of these blurry professional boundaries, right? Because you're in somebody's home every day, you understand who they are and what's important, and you can see often the cascade of what's going to happen. They're going to do something that you think is kind of dumb, and then there's going to be this, and then this, and then this, and you're going to have to deal with the consequences. The trick of it is that that is their choice. That is the really hard part of being a support worker, is that if it's not really risky, sometimes people need to live their lives and make those mistakes. That's what we all get to do in life, right? Sometimes we get to do a stupid thing, experience the stupid thing, and live with the consequences of it. But if you know that that stupid thing is actually really dangerous, it's a different conversation. So, it's the difference of kind of, oh, that friend is not a good influence on them, is really different from that friend is stealing all their money. So the tricky part for you is trying to find the balance and knowing that your balance and the family member's balance and the disabled person's balance may not all be exactly the same. And there's lots of that that's beyond your control. So your only thing that you can do is if you're finding a situation where you don't know what to do about those things, go back to this concept of duty of care and dignity of risk. And if you can, if you're feeling uncomfortable about the risk that's being taken, then who else can you invite into that conversation? How can you have a conversation with a disabled person, with the whānau members, with anybody that's considering confidentiality, um, to help kind of navigate your way through it. Because the other challenge of this is you shouldn't be having to make those decisions alone. You should be able to escalate it and talk to somebody and go, this is my dilemma. They've told me that this is happening and I'm not so sure it's a good idea. Um, but also in the end, if it doesn't have a big risk with it, sometimes you just let people live their lives. So, what are some common sticky bits that we come across? One of it's about introductions in public. So running into someone that you know or that they know when you're out in public. And I really encourage you to talk to the person you're supporting beforehand about how they want that situation managed. Or have in your mind a really blank way of introducing somebody that doesn't require what on earth you're doing with them. So this literally happened to me 2 weeks ago. I was in a cafe in the middle of a mall with a young lady that I was supporting, and we don't look like peers. I'm a good 20 years older than her. And so we ran into someone that she knew. And they came over. We're sitting at our table. They came over and they were like, "Hey, nice to see you." And she's like, "Yeah." And they were like, "What are you doing? What are you doing here?" And she's like, "Oh, I'm," and I saw her just go blank of like, what am I going to say here? And then she kind of said, "Oh, we're just doing some paperwork and stuff." And thankfully, they just took it at that and they were fine and off they went. But it was one of those situations where I went, yeah, actually, she didn't know how to describe who I was. So having that stuff in advance of being able to go, right, okay. And if I'd had to rescue her, thankfully, I've done this enough times that I could have come up with something nice and generic of, oh, we're just working on some stuff together. That's all we need. She didn't tell them my name. She didn't tell me where I was from, or anything else. She just went, yeah, we're just doing some paperwork. And then they talked to each other and had a chat and they went off. But it happens. And the more like when it's someone they know, it's a lot safer. When it's someone you know, when you're in the middle of a mall and somebody comes up to you, like your neighbor, your friend, and they go, "Oh, is that Bob? I've heard about you, Bob." It gets a bit weird. Because that means that you've been talking about the disabled person you're supporting at home. And often the disabled person gets a little freaked out about what you've been saying about them. So just considering how you're going to manage those dynamics if you run into people out in public. I talked earlier about personal and medical information and who actually needs to know it. So just, kind of keeping that stuff in mind. Another common one is when there's questions within the work team or within the family about the disabled person. So that for me is about remembering who the captain is, being clear at the beginning what you're supposed to share with people. So if you're supporting like a young adult who's getting out in the community and doing fun stuff, being able to talk to the parents about what's been happening and how it's been going might be really important. So I guess, knowing that you've got that consent, that you're allowed to go and talk to the family about it, that you're allowed to raise concerns with them in advance, so that when you choose to do it, you don't feel like you're being like dishonest in doing that. Um, then it's also thinking about, like I said before, when you run into somebody at the mall, thinking about how you talk about them, thinking about the words that you use and how respectful you are. You're going to have bad days and you're going to come home and you're going to want to rant to somebody about this thing that happened or that thing that happened. And like, that's a normal part of life. But also know that sometimes those people are going to cross paths. Sometimes you're going to run into them in the mall. You're going to come across them in other situations. So I had again this instance a couple of weeks ago where I was calling someone who had applied for a job. And so she was telling me about her most recent job, and how they did these jobs and how this woman had this diagnosis and how this thing had happened. And I went, I know exactly who she's talking about. I know that woman. Um, Not a small town. I live in Auckland. I was recruiting for a job in Auckland. It wasn't a small town situation, but I knew exactly who she was referring to. And thankfully, she was, perfectly fine on confidentiality, and she was really respectful. And I didn't bring up that I knew this woman because that would have been, again, making it more complicated. But in that instance, it's the thing, she could have said some really disrespectful things, or she could have declared some quite personal information, and she didn't know that I know this woman. So she didn't know that she was disclosing information that actually wasn't mine to know. Thankfully, I knew it all already. But it is a really cautious thing to do, and just remember that that stuff does come back to bite you sometimes. Um, and as I say, she was fine. She was telling me that she'd worked with a woman with autism. She was telling me about like why her job came to an end. There was nothing concerning about sharing parts of her job, but it's about being respectful and about knowing that you don't know who knows each other. Another common sticky point is about tasks and hours outside of what you've agreed. So the shifts running overtime, or the can you come early, or the can you do a shift on Sunday when I know that you said you didn't want to work on Sundays. That's often another place where you need to know what those professional boundaries are, because they do get really sticky sometimes. And there's not a right and a wrong. You might be really happy to come in on Sunday. You might be happy to start your shift early. You might be happy with all of those changes, but that's about boundaries and clear communication so that you are all on the same page and you don't feel like you're being taken advantage of, and they don't feel like they're being taken advantage of. So those are the instances that it gets tumultuous. Um, so one of the grey areas that constantly comes up is around professionalization and friendship. Lots of disabled people are vulnerable. They're isolated. They're looking for more connection. So inevitably, particularly in those peer roles, it gets blurry, it gets complicated. So some things for you to consider are how vulnerable that person is, how isolated and alone they are. Um, if you are blurring those professional boundaries, thinking about if you were going to leave your job, would you still spend time with them? If you quit your job on really good terms tomorrow, hey, guess what? I just won lotto and I don't need to work anymore. Um, are you going to stay in touch with them? Because if you've connected with them on social media, if you're inviting them into your family events, if you're, kind of bringing them into your friendship circles, all these stuff happens and it's not always a bad thing. But if you're only going to do it for the time that you're getting paid, you are setting that person up for a really big fall when you leave. Um, and in the same way, if you were going to leave on that job on bad terms, you two have a fight, their funding gets cut, and suddenly there is no more job. Something happens, and you're both mad at the end, or one of you's mad at the end. Um, how much of a gap are you going to leave in their life? If you are their one support worker and their one friend, and then suddenly something goes wrong, they are really vulnerable. And maybe you are really vulnerable. So just thinking really clearly about if those boundaries are blurring, make sure that you're doing it with your eyes open and being honest with yourself. Lots of people do it really naively. They get sent a Facebook friend request and they go, oh, that's kind of nice, sure. They get a couple of text messages in the middle of the night and they go, oh, it's nice you're thinking of me. You go, oh, I'm going to go do this cool thing in the weekend. You'd love it too. You should come with me and my mates. It happens really innocently. It happens with really good intentions, and people often don't think about the boundaries. They don't realize how slippery that slope is. And then they suddenly want to push people back out of the friend zone, back into just a professional relationship. So my best advice is to notice it and to make conscious choices. Or if you've got a person who is open to that kind of conversation, then having that conversation up front. And I really don't think there's anything wrong with saying, look, I really like you and I really enjoy spending time with you and we have a really cool dynamic, but I'm worried that if I accept that friendship request and something changes in our employment, that that we're going to end up in an awkward situation. So I'm just going to stick to this, keep my professional boundaries in place. Um, but yeah, it's a really, really complicated piece. Um, and the other element of this really well-intentioned blurry boundaries is that then you get another employee who doesn't blur their boundaries in the same way, and the disabled person gets left feeling like they're not good enough. So for example, I've had support workers who go, oh, I won't charge you for mileage. You don't need to pay for that. Don't worry about it. Or they show up with their fresh home baking, or with all these lovely things that are really well intentioned. And then that person leaves, a new support worker comes and they need the money. They can't afford to not get paid for mileage. So suddenly they're going, well, pay for my mileage. I don't have any magic baking for you. And the disabled person feels like they're getting a poorer quality service. I'm not saying don't bake for people. I'm not saying demand every penny, but it is really important that you consider when you're doing these lovely things that you actually might be setting up like future dramas for people. There isn't a right and a wrong. It's all grey blurriness. So what are you supposed to do about it? That's, I guess, the key piece of it. And it's not easy. The best thing we can do is talk about it before we need it, set the boundaries, explain the situation. If you can do that before it's become a problem, it's way easier. But you might have missed that boat already. Who knows? Um, it doesn't happen overnight. Boundaries don't just kind of collapse in one giant leap. It usually happens step by step. And so it's one one text after shift, one, could you do this extra thing for me? One, I know you don't want to do this task, but I need it done. Could you please? And that can create the situation. So noticing that and I guess knowing that that's valid to feel that these things are building up um, is really helpful. And still, the earlier we talk about it, the better it is before you're really grumpy about it, because that's what happens, right? Someone says, "Oh, just stay for an extra 5 minutes and do this, and just do this extra bit for me," and suddenly that becomes every single day. And by the time that happens, often the dynamic is breaking down, and it's really hard to go back to what was positive. So having your line, having your thing you're going to say, having your boundary, the words for your boundary in your mind can be really helpful. So if you feel like they are constantly asking you to stay a little bit later, or if you feel like they are over disclosing their personal information, um, whatever it is that they're doing, um, knowing what you're going to say in advance can be really good. Kind of pre-scripting, okay, I know that you've asked me to do this extra task, but today I really need to leave on time. In fact, this is my reality. This is what I need. I need us to finish on time each time because um the more that we can do that, it's just easier to do, I guess, when the words are already clear in your mind. You can tell they weren't clear in my mind just then. Um, Separating the person from the request can be really helpful. So when you say, I don't want to help you, it's a really that's about the person. That feels like it's I don't want to help you. Versus that's not a thing that I can do. It's a really different thing. So being able to say, look, like I know that you've been asking me recently to help you in the shower, and at the beginning I told you that that wasn't a thing that I felt comfortable doing. I can't do that because it doesn't sit comfortably with me. But I can help you make a plan of how you can still get help to do that task. Is about you. It's about you. You don't want to do that. You're not able to provide that. That's not something that suits your life and your world, is really different from you shouldn't ask me to do that. I don't want that to happen, which is far more about the disabled person having done something wrong. Because usually for them, it comes from a place of naivety, desperation. You are their safe person and they're asking for your help. So making sure that they can still ask you for help, um, but that you are not having to do stuff that's outside of where your comfort sits. Um, so it's not about feeling bad about something. You noticing that you've got boundaries and setting some limits is not it's not a bad thing. It's a really good thing. And we talked before about this friendship blurriness. Being able to talk about that, being able to name it and own it is really helpful before you get too far. So don't feel guilty when that stuff happens. This is the really complicated part of support work. Um, it's about deciding what you're going to do about it because it very rarely magically fixes itself. So, um, yeah, and the use I, not you, it's the same kind of concept as I'm not able to respond to text messages outside of shifts is really different from you need to stop doing this. It's just about the tone and about the implication. You are setting a boundary that is about you. You are creating, kind of something that's going to mean that you can be your best self at work, far less than you are trying to tell the disabled person off for whatever it is that they've done. Um, and then again, it's this you've noticed that something's going on. You've tried to prep your words so that you know how you're going to raise it with a disabled person. And then hopefully you've raised it with the disabled person. And then coming back and checking in with yourself of like, have I done that? Did I hold my line? And kind of, I guess, noting whether or not things are getting better. And knowing that often when the disabled person is asking you for things that blur your boundaries, that's what's coming naturally for them. So it's not necessarily something they can turn off. If it's, like actually when you ask me to do these tasks, you ask it in a way that, feels really argumentative or bossy. And I find it really hard with the way that gets phrased. Um, that's not a thing that a person can change their tone of voice and their language with 100% accuracy every time. So you do sometimes need to keep coming back to it and helping them build their awareness of what it is that you're finding really challenging. Um, but it's complicated. All of this stuff is two people trying to maintain a dynamic in what is often quite complex situation. So yeah, it's really valuable to think it through and to be prepared in advance. And now we're going to talk about pay equity, which is a bit of a weird tangent, because we had a different plan for the workshop and then we went to write it up. We're like, and pay equity, just pop it on the end there. So quite a lot of years ago, there was a pay equity case that said that disability support work is paid less than average jobs, because of the largely female workforce in support work. So this year there's been a whole lot of new pay equity government rules and stuff, that are still being resolved, but the historic pay equity stuff is still in place. And what that was it basically sets some minimum wages that support workers need to be paid, and they were set quite a long time ago. So they are um, not entirely relevant now. But basically, what it said was that depending on your qualifications, there are minimum rates that support workers need to be paid. In an individualized funding space, people can get paid whatever the support, whatever the disabled person feels is relevant. So they have a budget. It's not often an awesome rate of pay, but that's what they have to work within, and they can choose to pay you any magic number that works for their calculations, as long as it is over the minimum. So if you have no qualifications, the minimum is now minimum wage. It's in fact lower than minimum wage, but they can't pay you less than minimum wage. But if you have a level 3 or a level 4 qualification, there's now extra, like above that they have to pay. So it's based on the certificate in health and well-being. That's the general qualification that we're talking about. And so a level 4 qualification gives you a minimum pay rate of 28 to 25. So it's worth significantly more than the minimum wage. In individualized funding, people can choose to pay their support workers 28, 25, whether or not they've got a qualification. But if you have a qualification, that is the minimum that they can pay you. And so there is always the health and wellbeing certificate. That's where it started from. But since then, they did a whole lot of kind of checking out other qualifications to see if they are equivalent. So if you've got a bachelor's degree in psychology, that is equivalent. And some interesting things like beauticians and massage therapists and stuff have also been cross-referenced across, because basically they look at, is it kind of a vaguely related field, and the level of knowledge and information that you need to have to get whatever those qualifications are. So some of them don't cross across, kind of weird irrelevant qualifications like forestry and things like that don't necessarily come across. But lots of the caring interpersonal roles will cross-reference across. So it's worth having a look if you do have a qualification, even if you think it's not relevant, to see whether or not the your qualifications you have are considered when you're looking at your rate of pay. And so if you Google or go to that very long website on the bottom of the slide, about equivalent qualifications for pay equity, you will be able to see what has and hasn't been evaluated. They're not doing any more evaluations because this decision is so old now that it's out of date. But it is what's there is approved. So if you have one of those other qualifications, it counts across. And if you are embarking on a world of support work, it's worth considering how you can get the qualification that will get you the minimum pay rates if that's important to you. So, having said all of that, we come back to our captain. We come back to you as a support worker with your kete of communication knowledge, and we're thinking about the fact that this is a partnership. This is you two working together to communicate. This is you two setting boundaries. It's about making sure that it is working together and it's not kind of building one person up and pushing another person down in either direction. So that kind of partnership is really key. So that brings us to the end of our conversation. And I will say thank you for joining us.